Hi everyone, welcome to Julie Reads Her Bookshelf. I'm Julie, and for those of you who are new to this channel, this is a channel where I read through all of the unread books on my bookshelf until we reach 0, and we are a long way from that. I thought today I would do a video just recapping some of my favorite books of 2024, but also talking about my theme for 2025. So for some of you who might be unfamiliar with my approach to reading, I mostly read based on my mood, but I do like to have an annual theme so that it gives some structure to my reading where I read predominantly but not exclusively based on a particular theme. And that theme can be an era in history, it can be a genre, it can be a particular author, or it can be books from a particular region. And this year, my theme for the year is bricks. So I'll talk a little bit about the kind of books that I have planned, but I want to start just by recapping a little bit my reading in 2024. Now, 2024 is probably my worst reading year in quite some time. So normally in the course of a year, I read between 30 to 40 books. It's not a particularly high number, certainly for YouTube. I know there are plenty of kind of booktube people who read a lot more than I do. But I feel okay about that. I work full-time as a lawyer. I run my own practice. I also teach at the local university here in Australia, and I also sit on a number of volunteer boards. So I feel like my life is quite packed and quite busy, so I don't feel too bad about getting through 30 to 40 books. Actually, I feel like that's a really respectable number given how many things I've got going on in my life. But this year has been particularly tough, mostly because at work I've been extremely busy, but also I moved into a new office during the year. So there was a whole process of getting that set up, buying furniture, doing the office move, and it was kind of taking up and consuming a lot of my time. In addition to that, I've also spent a lot of time on my hobbies, my other hobbies, in addition to reading this year, such as photography and pottery. So I feel like even though I haven't read as much as I have in previous years, it's been replaced by things that are of value to my life rather than, I haven't been sitting on my couch doom scrolling every day. So of the books that I did read in 2024, I have 3 honorable mentions and 1 book that stands head and shoulders above all the others as being my favorite book of the year. So I'll start with the honorable mentions. The first book I really loved this year was Morris by Ian Forster. Before 2024, I had read Where Angels Fear to Tread by Ian Forster, and that was his first published work. But Morris is his last published work, although I don't think it's his last written work, because he wrote it and then basically didn't publish it because of its homosexual themes until he died. So this was published posthumously. Even though I've only read 2 works by Ian Forster, I get this sense whenever I open his books that I am in such a safe pair of hands. He does not go on tangents like Victor Hugo, but in terms of the character, the plot, the pacing, he is a writer that thinks about how all of these things fit together into a novel. And I just feel this sense of trust in this author that I very rarely get with a particular author. So as I expected, I really like this book. It has this kind of aching beauty about it, and I thought it was really sad actually that Ian Forster wrote in the foreword to this novel that it was really important for him to give 2 gay characters a happy ending. And you do get a happy ending, but it's a kind of bittersweet ending because it's an ending that presents an escape from reality, because the reality of the times that this book was set in, which is kind of, I think, of the 1930s, it was difficult for 2 gay men living in the UK to actually be left in peace and to be able to pursue their love and their relationship openly in a way that is accepted by the world. So there's a kind of sadness with the happy ending because it's a form of escapism rather than a reflection of reality. So I really enjoyed it. If you are thinking about trying out Ian Forster, I actually think this book is a pretty good place to start. The second book on my honorable mentions list is Che Guevara's Motorcycle Diaries. Now, One of the benefits to doing this project where I read through my unread shelf is that I'm going to the depth of my backlist, because I'm fairly certain I bought this book when I was at university and I just never got around to reading it. And I wasn't sure what I expected from this book when I started, but I certainly didn't expect a travelogue that is both wise and warm and funny. I absolutely love this. Che Guevara was only 23 when he took the trip, so I was surprised at the level of insight and respect that he brought to his travels and the way that he approached different cultures, particularly the indigenous cultures of the countries that he traveled through. I was a little bit concerned that it might be a bit preachy in terms of, using his travels to promote communism, but actually wasn't like that at all. This was written before Che Guevara became a communist. So if there was anything political in this book, it was more along the veins of post-colonialism. The best part of this book was actually just how funny and young and idealistic him and his friend were at the time. I really enjoyed this. I highly recommend it if you haven't read it. And it's also quite a short read, which is quite useful sometimes when you're wanting a little bit of a palate cleanser after reading some big or heavy books. And the final book on my honorable mentions list is Lincoln and the Bardo by George Saunders. I didn't really discuss this book at the time I read it because this was when I was going through a little bit of a reading slump and it wasn't really worth it making a video just about one book. But I thought this was absolutely brilliant. I've only read, I think, Swim in a Pond in a Lake. That's the name of the book by George Saunders, where he writes a series of essays about Russian short story writers, and he breaks down each short story as he goes. And that was one of my favorite books last year. And now, a year later, this is one of my favorite books for 2024. So I think George Saunders is another safe pair of hands that I can trust. The premise of this book is set during the American Civil War, where Lincoln's son dies, and it has a profound impact both on Lincoln and his wife, who pretty much never recovers. So ultimately, this is a book about grief. It's a book about the love that parents have for their children. It's a book about moving on. The book kind of has a funny format. It's written almost as like blank verse. So I don't know if you can tell, you've got dialogue and then the person speaking the dialogue just underneath. And I think a lot of people found it quite gimmicky at the time it was released. I think it actually works really well with this format and with the story. It gave the story an interesting frenetic pace and I just really enjoyed it. It's one of my kind of more memorable reads for 2024. And at last we come to my favorite book of the year. If you have been following kind of my monthly wrap-ups this year, you might know which one it is. And it is The Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Kingsolver. I was a little bit concerned when I started this book because I knew it was a book set in Africa, but written by an American writer. And I just thought there are so many ways in which this could go wrong. But it didn't. It was wonderful. This is a book about a missionary family who moved to the Congo kind of in the early 60s at a time when the Congo was just gaining its independence from Belgium. The book itself is written from the perspective of 5 women, the mother and the 4 daughters of the family. And even though these women were subjected to horrific violence and manipulation and gaslighting by the father of this family, their sense of identity and agency, their strength and their vulnerabilities come through so clearly in the way that Barbara Kingsolver wrote this book. I thought it was absolutely brilliant, and this was by far my favorite book of the year. I'm kind of really sad it took me so long to read this because I would have bought this, I think, when I was in high school. But as I said, one of the great things about going through your personal backlist and reading some books that have been unread for far too long is that you discover absolute gems like this. So this is my favorite book, highly recommend. And now on to my theme for 2025. As I said in my last video, my theme for 2025 is BRICS, and that is an acronym that stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So I thought this theme would be a great opportunity for me next year to direct my attention intentionally to books coming from the non-Western world, and also some books in translation, because at least with Brazil, Russia and China, the books will be originally written in a different language and then translated into English. And I do love a translated novel. So I want to talk a little bit about my possibilities for next year in terms of my reading theme, starting of course with B for Brazil. Now, I have not read any books by a Brazilian author except The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. And I think it's fair to say that Paulo Coelho is not a good representation of Brazilian literature, because The Alchemist, as far as I can remember, is kind of like a Chinese proverb in a book. And why would you read a whole book when a Chinese proverb will do? So I'm not a huge fan of The Alchemist, but I do think that Brazilian literature has a totally different face that I don't know. So the two authors that come up most often that have been recommended to me most frequently when it comes to Brazilian literature are Machado de Assis and Clarice Lispector. With Machado, I think the book that he's most known for is the posthumous memoirs of Brás Cubas. I know nothing about this book other than the fact that it's apparently a dead man writing his own memoir, which seems like quite a kind of a magical realism type of setup to a book. And I do like a little bit of magical realism, so I'm kind of looking forward to reading that one. With Clarice Lispector, I think she's most often compared to Virginia Woolf, who I quite like. So I'm expecting maybe more of a modernist stream of consciousness style. And the two books of hers that I know of, one is Near to the Wild Heart, which I think is kind of her first major work. The other one is Agua Viva, which I think is quite short, which might be of benefit to kind of sample her writing and see if I enjoy her. Now, I actually don't have any physical books by Brazilian writers on my unread shelf. So because I'm not allowed to buy books until I finish all of my unread books, I think I'm going to go to my local library and just see what's available and then go from there. So that's one thing that I'm looking forward to exploring this year as well, because I don't have books from all of the countries that I've chosen. I'm going to be using my local library a bit more and discovering some of its offerings and services there. Now, the next cab off the rank is R for Russia. And I have done previously a reading theme based on Russian literature. I think in 2022, I did a whole year where I read Russian books from the 19th century. And this time around, I don't want to double up, so I'm going to be concentrating on Russian literature from the Soviet era. And I happen to have two books on my unread shelf from that era. First, we have Life and Fate by Vasily Grossman. Now, this book is often referred to as the War and Peace of the Soviet era. And I'm expecting a vast cast of characters. I'm expecting a portrait of a society. I'm expecting intense questions about the meaning of life, because that is what ultimately every Russian book seems to be about. Like I said, there are certain countries and there are certain authors that you just feel like are really safe choices. And Russia so far has been one of them. There hasn't really been any book from Russia that I haven't loved. So I'm really looking forward to exploring the Soviet era, perhaps starting with Life and Fate. The other book that I have planned for Soviet era Russian literature is Dr. Zhivago by Boris Pasternak. Now, there is a little bit of commonality between these two books in that they were both unable to be published in Russia during the Soviet era, and both of these books were smuggled out of Russia and published overseas first. So if I really enjoy this book, I think I'm going to read some books about how this particular book came to be smuggled out of Russia and published. I think the CIA was involved. So I think that would be a really interesting kind of side project to go along with my reading of Dr. Zhivago as well. The I in BRIC stands for India, and I quite like Indian literature, at least a little bit of it that I've read. And I have quite a few works on my unread shelf by Indian authors, which I hope to get around to next year. The first one is The Ministry of Utmost Happiness by Arundhati Roy. Now, Arundhati Roy wrote probably one of my favorite books ever, which is The God of Small Things. And I absolutely love this book. It's achingly beautiful. And I think from what I've heard about The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, it's quite different from The God of Small Things. It's much more of an expansive book with a large cast of characters and occurring in different locations and different decades of Indian history. So I'm curious to see how I handle a book of such breadth. It doesn't have as universally good reviews as The God of Small Things, but I have heard some positive things. So I'm curious to try out this book. The second unread Indian book on my bookshelf is Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children. Now, I have not read any Salman Rushdie at all, and I feel like this is such a gap in my reading that needs to be remedied. Obviously, I want to read his most well-known and iconic work, and I have made an attempt previously to start this book. I remember enjoying it, and I can't quite remember why I never went beyond the first couple of 100 pages. So this is my second attempt at reading this, and I'm fairly confident I'll actually get through it. And the last book on my short list of books by Indian authors is A Suitable Boy by Vikram Seth. And it's probably the most intimidating of all of the books on this list today because it is huge. It is over 1,400 pages. I understand it's a book that centers around the quest by the family of a girl to find her a suitable boy to marry. And I really hope she finds it by the end of the book, because I would be very annoyed if after 1,400 pages there were no suitable boys. The C in BRIC stands for China, and that is of course my country of birth. And despite being born there, I actually don't know that much about Chinese literature, and I'm really curious to find out because for whatever reason, I have retained my language skills. I have retained the ability to read Chinese. So I'm in a unique position where I actually don't have to read Chinese literature in translation. All of the books I have in mind for next year, though, are books with English language translation. So if you are curious about these books, it's totally possible for you to go out and get it in English. The first book that I'm thinking about reading is Golden Age by Wang Xiaobo. Now, I know Chinese pronunciations can be quite difficult, so I'm going to put up the spelling on the screen if I remember. Wang Xiaobo is kind of a cult writer when it comes to sort of 1990s Chinese literature, and this is a book that uses sex to satirize what happened during the Cultural Revolution. So I'm curious to see how it's done. I'm a little bit worried it might be quite misogynistic, which is one of the reasons why I haven't actually read this book yet. Wang Xiaobo died very young. I think he was in his 40s when he died very suddenly from an illness, not from anything untoward happening to him. But he left behind a body of work that includes the Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age, a collection of short stories and some dramas. So I think this is his most well-known work and probably a good gateway into seeing if I want to explore him more as an author. Penguin publishes a translation of this novel in, I think, the modern Penguin Modern Classics line, which is the blue line over here. So it is possible to get a translation by this author. I don't know how the translator went because I think there's a lot of sexual innuendos in this book, and I'm not sure how well they translate into English. But if you are curious, check him out because he's actually really well known and has a bit of a cult following in China. Now, when it comes to Chinese literature, the writer that I always recommend people is Aileen Chang. And the reason for that is that she is probably one of the most well-known writers in China, certainly of modern Chinese literature. She has an absolute cult following in China. She's incredibly accessible in the West because all of her works have been translated by, I think, both Penguin and the New York Review of Books. So it's very easy to get access to her works. Aileen Chang is also a writer who unites many Chinese communities because she was born in Shanghai. She fled Shanghai to go to Hong Kong during the Japanese occupation. And then when the communists took over after the Civil War, she fled China to go and live in the United States, where she spent the rest of her days. So she really has this perspective of both a mainlander, a Hong Kong resident, and also as part of the Chinese diaspora who had to leave when the communists took power. So she is much beloved. The work that would be a good place to start would be Lust Caution, particularly if you watch the film, because the film is very faithful to the story. But when you actually read the story, you'll realize just how much work Ann Lee had to do to flesh out this extremely pithy short story into a full feature-length film. The book by Aileen Chang I want to read next year is Red Rose, White Rose. This is a collection of short stories. I'm sorry if I look like I'm holding up a completely blank book. It is the actual book. I don't really like book dust jackets, so I normally throw them out. So this is a book where I've actually just thrown out the dust jacket and it happens to be totally blank underneath. But this is a collection of short stories by Aileen Chang. Aileen Chang is really well known for her short stories, and this is one of the collections that was published as a collection in her lifetime, in fact in the 1940s when she was most active, and I know this is kind of very well regarded in the overall oeuvre of her work, so I'm looking forward to reading it. And finally, the S in BRICS stands for South Africa, and this is again a country that I know very little about in terms of its literary tradition. The most famous South African writer that I know of is J.M. Coetzee, or Coetzee, I'm not sure how to pronounce his surname. The book of his that I know of is Disgrace. I think it's about a professor in post-apartheid South Africa who seduces one of his students, and that's kind of like the disgrace in the novel. I'm curious to see how that kind of theme stacks up in today's society, because this book was published, I think, in the late 90s, and we've come to view power dynamics very differently since the late 90s. We've also come to view certain racial issues very differently since then as well. So I'm curious to see whether some of these themes in the novel will hold up and how he handled it, whether he was ahead of his time in terms of his own understanding of that particular power dynamic, or whether I would be reading it feeling slightly furious about some of the way that those issues and themes have been addressed in that novel. The other South African book that I was really hoping to read next year is A Long Walk to Freedom by Nelson Mandela. This is his autobiography about his early life and his years spent in prison, and I'm curious to read in his own words what all of that was like and how he views it with the benefit of hindsight. So I think that would be a really important read for me in 2025. So there we have it. That's my kind of plans for 2025. What are your reading plans? Are there any books that you want to get to next year? I think it'll be a really interesting year, focusing predominantly on literature from non-Western countries. I think it'll be a really intense year, both at work and also outside of work. I hope to travel a bit next year. I've got some trips planned to China. And maybe I'll pick up some new books there. We'll see. Until next time, Happy New Year. I hope 2025 brings everyone excellent reading and great experiences all round. Bye.